Good evening and welcome to episode 9 of Grains of Wisdom from Powerscourt Distillery. I'm Caroline Gardner, Marketing Manager here at Powerscourt Distillery, and I'll be your host this evening. Our topic for conversation this evening is the independent mindset, and we are very excited and very fortunate to have with us who many would consider the pioneers of independent Irish whiskey in the 20th century for our chat this evening. Starting with a gentleman who really needs no introduction, an international businessman, a serial entrepreneur across many diverse industries, from diamond exploration to whiskey production. A businessman who was described by the Irish Times as one of the most unorthodox and successful businessmen operating in Ireland today. An academic, an explorer, a whiskey producer. We have invited Mr. John Teeling to join us this evening to hear about one area of his varied and accomplished career, the founding of Cooley Distillery. The ambitions, the challenges, and the many successes during this time. You're very welcome, John. Another gentleman who again is very familiar to us all in the whiskey industry and indeed far beyond, a former CEO of the textile giant Fruit of the Loom, director and chairman of the International Irish Fund for 18 years, which procured over 2.7 billion for 6,000 individual projects, creating more than 50,000 jobs in Northern Ireland post the Good Friday Agreement. More recently, he has mentored and advised many IT, telecoms, and whiskey distilleries. William McCarter was one of the first directors of Cooley Distillery, and we are delighted to have him here with us this evening to give us his unique perspective on this very disruptive and creative period in the setting up of independent Irish whiskey distilling. So you're also very welcome, Willie.
Thanks very much, Caroline.
No problem. And last but not least, our own award-winning master distiller here at Powerscourt Distillery, who I'm sure you're all very familiar with at this stage, Noel Sweeney. Noel played a key role in Cooley Distillery from 1989, resulting in the production of some of the finest quality whiskies, winning awards around the world, which we will come to discuss during the course of our conversation this evening. So you're also very welcome, Noel.
Thanks, Caroline. Nice to see the guys back together again.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Indeed, we're welcoming a very wide audience this evening. We have many distributors tuning in with us from around the world. We've had massive interest, as would be to be expected, with such a fantastic panelist lineup. So to kick us off, and to start the conversation going, perhaps we can start with the infamous plaque on the wall of the Boston bar, the Plough and the Stars. It commemorates the location where the initial idea for independent Irish whiskey was first conceived. So I'm sure there's more to that story. So perhaps you can tell us about the meeting and how your interest in Irish whiskey developed over the period. Maybe we can start with you, John.
Certainly delighted to do it. I was a student at Harvard, and Willie was a student at MIT down the road, and literally the Plough and the Stars was a bar on Mass Avenue about halfway between us. Yes, that's it. It still looks like that. And part of our work for our various degrees was that we had to do projects, and I was asked to do a case study on Irish whiskey, which I did and thought was awful. The failure to go of Irish whiskey from 60% of the world to 2% shocked me. And I looked at the background a little bit more on it, and another case study, and revealed that they had missed a lot of opportunities, the then Irish whiskey companies, and they gave the opportunity for Scotch to take over. So I thought, looked at that, there was an oligopoly, soon to be a monopoly, and that there should be opportunities there. Ended up in a bar in the Plough and the Stars sometime in June or July, Willie, I'm not sure, in 1970, and Willie was there, and he was doing a degree at MIT and also looking at whiskey. And really, I think independently, I thought, having talked with Willie there, that there was an opportunity in Irish whiskey, and I know that Willie did also, but it was another 16 or 17 years. We had other things to do before we got together in Cooley. And I mean, now Willie may have a different perspective.
No, John, I have very similar perspective, and just to keep the actors in the thing apprised. Before I went to MIT, I had met a Dubliner called Breffney Tomlin, who is still a very good friend of John's and was at that time. Breffney came, a very enterprising guy, to do a PhD at MIT with a wife and 3 children. Because he was the PhD student of Professor Tom Allen, who I'm glad to say is still with us, still living in Boston, and I was a research assistant to Professor Tom Allen. Breffney and I were on the same floor at MIT, and he came, I think, in June, John, and my memory is that you probably came about the end of July or beginning of August.
No, I think I was earlier. I was the end of June.
Maybe, but anyway, Breffney and I got quite friendly, and he said to me one day, there's a guy coming from Dublin that you really ought to meet called John Teeling. And the reason that we met in the Plough and Stars was because all US universities at the time were severely disrupted by Vietnam War protests. And Professor Tom Allen, being the enterprising guy he was, couldn't hold his classes at MIT, but he offered to hold his classes in the Plough and Stars, which was 10 minutes or 15 minutes from MIT. So when Breffney said, you got to meet this guy called John Teeling, I think Tom was there as well. The 3 of us went up to meet this John Teeling in the Plough and Stars, because that's where Tom held his classes. And many as the class was held at MIT, or in the Plough and Stars. There's no doubt John and I did talk a lot about Irish whiskey. It's interesting to note that at that time, exports to the US were only 100,000 cases. And today, of course, there's several million cases being exported. And a lot of that is down to the kind of work that John, aided by myself and David Hines and Noel Sweeney and quite a few others, a lot of that is down to that effort.
Indeed, great accolades, which we will actually come on to discuss in more detail, Willie. You both had very successful time in the US, and you eventually returned home to Ireland and got involved in family businesses and other businesses, ranging from, indeed, ladies' underwear with the national brand, Willie. I think you were supplying Duns and Pennies and many different outlets at the time. There was hosiery with Glen Abbey, textiles with Fruit of the Loom, and of course much diamond exploration, John. But all the while you were both gathering diverse experience, but very much with the passion for disrupting the status quo. And that really brings us to the events leading to the founding, I suppose, of Cooley in 1985. John, can you tell us a little bit about the landscape at the time, and what was the ambition and the major challenges for Cooley when you first started out?
Well, by 1985, both Willie and I had a lot more experience than we had in 1970. And we also probably had some capital, both of which were important. Irish whiskey had become a total monopoly in 1973 and was really going nowhere. Monopolies, by their nature, tend to protect what they have rather than to do innovation. I always felt that there was an opportunity to disrupt that industry simply because Irish whiskey uses Irish thyme, Irish water, Irish air, and a lot of Irish grain, and that's it. And most of it is export. So it was a perfect industry for Irish industrial development, which was my research area. Mm-hmm. And the opportunity came up to purchase the Cooley Distillery, which at that time was an alcohol plant, originally one of 4 established by the government to process potatoes on very poor peninsulas, very often bad potatoes which couldn't be sold elsewhere. Very unsuccessful in terms of the fact that it just wasn't that economic. They were used to make methanol that had to be put into car engines. They went into, the one in Cooley went into producing alcohol from molasses, which was brought in from into green ore. And yeah, that's what it looked like at that. Now the idea was, and there was the critical reason for success is that almost all whiskey is a blend, which means you need two types of whiskey. And Willie was struggling with this in Donegal, I know, I knew later. So you require pot stills to make the malt, and you require columns. And the only possible supplier of column whiskey or grain whiskey was Irish Distillers, because columns are capital intensive and they are basically big chemical plants and quite different from the pot stills. But Cooley had columns to make the alcohol. And that was the reason we bought it. Nobody else wanted it. It had been sitting there for 18 months. And myself and Donald Kinsella at the time, we bought it at quite a reasonable price, simply because nobody else wanted it. And a very short time after that, Willie came to me, and he had been looking at establishing something in Donegal. But the real essence of the project was that we would have the ability to make grain whiskey, which still makes up 85% of all whiskies, as well as pot still. And that's how it started. We were not beholden to Irish Distillers at that stage. We could make everything. We were independent.
And Willie, you were one of the first directors, and indeed you had the foresight to buy up some brand names when you came home to Ireland from Watts, I think, was one of the oldest distilleries. Tyrconnell was one of the key names. So how did you come to contribute at the beginning of Cooley being founded?
Well, the first thing I'd have to say on that, Caroline, is that when John and David Hines and that were figuring out what to do at Cooley Distillery, as John says, they did construct a grain or column still plant together with a pot still plant or single malt or a malt plant. And that's still a very unusual construction, and because it was very, very enterprising, very innovative, and it stuck to Cooley all the years of its existence, and indeed led to grain whiskey, which we'll maybe talk about a little bit later. But you asked me about Tyrconnell. When I came back from MIT, John and I, having spent many the evening drinking in the Plough and Stars and discussing whiskey and so on, I had a very good friend in Trinity who became a professor there. But he, funnily enough, he was a member of the Watt family of Andrew A. Watt in Derry. That's a name that isn't really known now, but if you look at your Barnard, who was a geographer in 1885, who surveyed the whiskey distilleries of Great Britain and Ireland, you will find that Andrew A. Watt was certainly the largest distillery in these islands, had put in 2 massive coffee stills or column stills from the first one in 1832, and Watts was an absolutely massive distillery, very wealthy family. My friend didn't benefit from that, but what happened there was, he said to me, you know, these people are going out of business, and if you wanted to get a couple of good whiskey brands, Tyrconnell and Inishowen, now's your chance. So I acquired those, did a lot of fiddling around with them, and indeed for several years, but I couldn't get Irish Distillers or anybody to supply me with whiskey. And eventually John bought the Cooley Distillery from the liquidator of Chemical Chorata, and he said, we're going to have whiskey now, and why don't you roll in what you have? So I rolled in Tyrconnell and Inishowen, and also a very significant thing, I had a very young student. I must have been guilty of employing child labor in those days, because there's a guy called Johnny Hart, had spent 9 months in the US on a marketing scholarship, effectively creating how to premiumize Irish whiskey in the US. And Johnny came back to me and said, look, I've got this. And I said, well, I'm going to roll this into Cooley Distillery. And I asked John, could I roll Johnny Hart in as well? And John said, yeah, go ahead. So Johnny Hart spent 9 very good years with Cooley Distillery, went on to go to First Ireland, where he was a marketing and sales director. now the proud owner of 5 farms. The very upmarket cream liqueur. I better stop talking here.
Yes, and he's a well-known name in the whiskey industry, Willie, definitely. I think we bring in Noel at this stage, because Noel, you joined in 1989, and that, I suppose it'd be interesting to understand what your brief was at the time and how the portfolio was developing.
Yeah, I mean, initially I worked in the old chemical Toronto plant, and it for about 8 years, and it closed down in 1983. And as John said, then it lay idle for a number of years. And there used to be a guy that also joined John when he bought it over, was a guy called Eugene Smith, and another guy was there as well. But anyway, I had gone off to Galway to do a little bit of work with another guy in making food flavors and pharmaceuticals for intermediaries and stuff like that for a few years. And the guys had set up the distillery and were getting it running, and they needed somebody that had some experience in the analysis of the spirit. And I had been talking with David Hines, was the general manager, and he'd approached. We got together. I can't remember exactly the details of it all, but they had somebody working in the lab, and she eventually left, and I joined as quality manager in 1989. And at that stage, you can see we had David Hines there on the left, myself, and the 2 customs officers that were there, because you couldn't open the place without the one customs officer being present. Gordon Mitchell, who joined, I think, in 1990. And Gordon really was responsible for running the grain plant initially. And then to the right is David Carolan, who's still working away in Cooley as a logistics manager. And to the right of David then was a guy called Eddie Marmion from Cooley. And Eddie was a great enthusiastic contributor to everything that went on in Cooley and in Cooley Distillery. But yeah, at the time, at the start of my brief was basically quality manager, and to keep an eye on the samples and the stock, and keep a track of the stock. And like Gordon and Alan Chappie ran the stills, and it's from them that I learned so much about distilling. But in the early years, it was basically getting the spirit and getting it into barrels and then keeping track of it. And we had, again, as I mentioned before, several people involved from Scotland and other places, like Billy Walker, we had Jimmy Lang, who was another great distiller in his day, and they always came along with advice and help, and because John will remember, we weren't exactly the flavour of the month in other distilling quarters in Ireland, so we were shunned, and it was very difficult at that time to get any kind of input other than from our friends in Scotland. So that's where we started it off, and it took us a few years to get going.
I don't know if you can see that. I should have, I apologize, I should have brought it. Can anybody see what that is? That is a bottle from the very first cask in Cooley, filled in 1989. And we just produced 10 bottles of it for the directors. It was opened in 1992 at a great day in Kilbeggan, in fact. A wonderful day. And that's one of the bottles I was looking for others, so I didn't know I had that. So that's, Noel, you would have been involved, very first cask.
Yes, I actually, if you look up at the back of the press there, I have a bottle that was given to me when I left Cooley Distillery, which was filled from the same cask. Yeah. And I think David Hines as well got one when he left after the Beam takeover. So there's not that many bottles of that flying around.
Oh, no, that was the 10. Yeah, no, well, there shouldn't be. There shouldn't
yes.
be.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, it was a great occasion. They had started distilling, I think, as you said, John, in around Easter time in 1989. I joined in June 1989, and June actually, I think it was this first week in June. I wasn't there till about the third week, but they had started putting whiskey into the barrels because the barrels were difficult to get at the time as well. There was a bit of a shortage around the world, but and again, we didn't have an awful lot of experience, so we were relying Scotch industries to some extent to get barrels, and Speyside Cooperage supplied barrels. Bushmills, actually, we got barrels out of Bushmills at one stage, and eventually, and I mean, remember, we got one consignment of barrels from Guatemala, I think in 1991 or something like that, which wasn't the best wood in the world. But, you know, we learned as we went along as to what was the best to do and how to do it. And that was how we moved in the early years anyways. But the biggest challenge, of course, with John and Willie was making sure they had the finance there. And that was a huge challenge at the time. And I think, John, you had some fun with what we call the BS or government schemes on investing money and all that, and tax relief.
I'm not so sure fun is the word I would use.
But there was certainly a lot of room, I suppose, you know, if we come back to the theme of the conversation tonight, the independent mindset, there was so many examples of creative innovation during this time. And as you said, you know, as you were alluding to there, Noel, needs must, and you know, it's trying lots of new things. And one of the topics that has been of huge interest to our audience over the last number of weeks was the introduction of Connemara. So a peated whiskey, peated whiskey is long considered the domain of, I suppose, Scottish whiskey. Bringing a peated Irish whiskey into the range under the name of Connemara would have probably been considered risky, but I suppose it would be really interesting for our audience this evening to have a little bit of insight into the factors that drove the birth of Connemara whiskey. So Noel or John, either of you want to take that one?
I give you a little bit on it because it's something that's fairly near to my heart as well, and one that we've had significant battles with the industry leader over the years. Because for the longest time, the monopolist said Irish whiskey wasn't peated, and you must remember the victor in a war always writes the history, so there's nothing wrong with that. That's just the way it is. And I had to do some research, and it turns out that most Irish whiskies were peated. And indeed, Bushmills was peated into the 1980s. And the reason is very simple. It really is very simple when you look at it. There was no coal. And the ones that went to coal-fired burning, coal-fired heating, were the ones on the coasts. And until the canals were built to go into the Midlands, and there's an excellent 10-page article on inland distilleries all using peat. But anyway, it all died out. It was gone because the monopolist didn't make it. So they said nobody else did. And I must say, neither Willie nor I nor the board knew much about what happened. David Hines and Brian Quinn, who's still with us, thank God, in Kilbeggan, decided they would make peated whiskey to sell in Japan because they wanted a strongly favoured whiskey, because the Japanese liked a highball, they liked a long drink, and so you couldn't lose the flavour if you had a delicate flavour and you filled it full of water. So they started to build whiskey in 1991, or to lay it down. Board didn't know, which is normal with boards. And then in 1995, it was mature. And all of a sudden we had mature malt whiskey and not the remotest idea how or where or what we were going to do with it, because we hadn't got as far as Japan at that stage. And in fact, didn't for another 10 years maybe. So a wonderful example of, at the time, we had a number of young employees who are European orientation, EOP employees. And we had Johnny Hart, as Willie already mentioned. And we put them into a room on a Friday afternoon, not too far from where I'm sitting now, and said, we have peated malt. Come out and tell us what to do with it. It was as simple as that, because we didn't know. And they came up with the name Connemara because they thought we could sell it in France, because it's a very strong drinking name. It's a drinking song in France. They came out with a dark green bottle, which was going to give the picture of strength. And they came out with a bottle that looked a lot like, I have a bottle of it here, if you have anybody who wants to see it. It comes out, exactly, that's a good one you have there, Noel. A lot like a Chivas Regal bottle. And that's where it came from. And to this day, despite all kinds of iterations and other things, it hasn't changed very much. And it's been very successful for Cooley. I think it's going to, for the independent distillers, I think there is going to be a big growth in peated malt. Now, it's a niche industry, and probably your panelists who are on this are serious whiskey people. It's a small niche, and even malt drinkers, not every malt drinker likes peated malt. We had a director, Lee Mallahan, he used to be furious at the idea of you saying 1/10 of 1%, which is like 1% like malt, sorry, 1/10 of 10% might like peated. So why are we wasting our time? Anyway, that's a long waffly story, but it was very interesting where it was, and it's a successful product now.
That's very interesting, John. And just to touch on one question we got in there from Bianca, were pot still whiskies peated as well in the duration of your research? Perhaps you came across that.
Yeah, it's a that's a very good question. She may be reading some of the controversy that's going on in Twitter and places like that right at the moment. Had to be, because remember, all the pot still is made with some peated malt, and so, or some malt, I should say, some malted barley. And the only way to dry the barley, to actually malt it, was with peat. So that's why the concept of peated pot still whiskey is very interesting. I think it's a very interesting concept, and it's one, I think it's a great innovation, and let people who are making it sell it and see does it work. I don't see why it shouldn't, but certainly inland distilleries, the pot still distilleries, had to use peated malt in their pot still.
And thank you so much for that, John. It's answered many questions which came up over the last number of weeks. And one that's been put to Noel, is there any plans for a peated whiskey from Powerscourt Distillery? But we've already said watch that space. So just perhaps to Noel, I don't know if you want to add anything to the production of the Connemara whiskey at all, or how was that at the time?
Yeah, I do remember distinctly the first new make spirit that we made, and we had a journalist over from the UK, a guy called Jim Murray, who since went on to write the many whiskey Bibles. But Jim was there, and we were tasting the new make peated malt, and he absolutely lost his mind with it altogether. He thought it was the bee's knees and cat's pajamas. And I don't know, I mean, a lot of the time we had to consider what kind of level of peating had been done at the time. And we all know the likes of the Lafroigs of this world, who are very, very heavily peated. So for an Irish peated malt, we kind of went for the view that we would have something that was relatively mild, would have the distinctive flavour, but not to be overpowering. And with the distillation system that was in Cooley, with the pot stills are both sized similarly, and shapes and all the rest of it, we were getting quite a sweet, delicate distillate. And the other thing was with peat as well, you tend to distill a little bit more spirit out of the spirit still, so your strength is weaker. And that also helps with the level of peat in the whiskey. So these were the kind of things that we had planned, if you could call it that, with Gordon at the time. It was 1992. And then afterwards, we bought in the peated malt from initially, I think it was Banagher. And there was a story behind that as well, because somebody had sent malt to James's Gate in Guinness, and there was they hadn't cleaned out the silos, and there was a smell of peat in the malt that arrived up there. So Guinness decided, okay, there's nobody going to make peated malt anymore in Ireland if they wanted to supply Guinness, and they were the biggest users of malt at that time. So that prompted us in Cooley. Then we ended up getting peated malt from Scotland, and that's where it's been sourced ever since. So we're still waiting for someone in Ireland to produce peated malt. Don't know if there's a word of somebody coming up with it in the near future. I'm not, but hopefully that'll come to pass.
Caroline, just as a point that Noel is saying there, it's from the production end. In Great Northern now we make quite a bit of peat, but it really does stink up the whole production process. From the silos, through the milling, through the mashing, through the distilling. So you really can't do it in a campaign of 1 or 2 weeks unless you're going to have a close down afterwards. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to run our, as I'm sure most of the others will, we run our campaign up to until you have your seasonal close down, and then you clean it all out, because it does linger on. And I know that in Cooley it was an issue for you guys, that maybe the first 3 or 4 distillations after it was cleaned still might have had a slight tinge of peat in it, though it wasn't meant to. Very difficult.
These are all the practical considerations, dampen down the creativity sometimes when it gets going. But just, I suppose, to come on to the next area, and with the construction and development of so many distilleries around the country, I suppose we've all had to think about future-proofing our operations. This was certainly something that was high on the considerations of the building project team, and utilising the waste heat from our stills to heat our visitor centre has contributed greatly to our sustainability goals. John, as you mentioned there earlier, you were very much ahead of the curve back in 1985 with the concept of future-proofing, integrating 2 column stills into the Cooley Distillery for the production of grain whisky. So I think, you know, we definitely need to have a talk about green ore and the bringing out to market of grain whisky. And I know, Willie, you told a very interesting story there at one of the many Christmas parties we had here at the distillery. So perhaps you can give us a little bit of insight into that thinking at the time.
Sorry, we asked me about grain whisky.
Yes, yes, indeed, yeah.
Well, hopefully I have this correct, but Noel or John can tell us if it is. Grain whisky, as a lot of people would know, was regarded as a very bland spirit. It was the major disruptor of the entire whisky industry, because when Aeneas Coffey invented the thing, or managed to patent the system, these canny Scots, or cousins across the water, managed to get hold of it, and they created blended whiskey from grain and malt. And there was a whole debate then with Dublin distillers and so on, whether this was the silent spirit or whether it was actually whiskey at all. And so grain whiskey had a very bland reputation for a long time, even though it was the base of a lot of Scottish whiskey fortunes. And indeed, it was the base of the fortunes of Andrew A. Watt in Derry, with his 2 big coffee stills, which were a feature of the landscape in Derry. But that's all a long-winded way of coming round to saying that I heard from John and David Hines and others that one day Noel was sampling grain whisky that had been in stock in inventory in Cooley for quite a while, and all of a sudden he realized, you know, this stuff that was supposed to be bland and so on is actually a tremendous taste to it. And from that, together, I'm sure, with David and John and others in the business, Cooley developed green ore single grain. Now, I don't know, John and Noel, whether I've got that right or not, but you guys can fill in the blanks. But as I understand it, that's sort of what happened. And because of that, you have beautiful grain whisky, not the least of which is in Powerscourt. There's some in Teeling Distillery, the distillery owned by John's sons. And John is producing his own single grain, and there's more coming.
I think it's interesting to kind of just put a bit in perspective. We discovered that we always wanted to make a light whiskey, because one of the problems historically for Irish whiskey is that it was perceived in international markets as being heavy and that it might give you a hangover. The young people favoured a lighter, slightly sweeter whiskey, and maize gives you a sweeter product than barley. So we knew that at the time. And then the inimitable David Hines, we can talk about it because he's not here. When he designed the columns in Cooley, he put some copper plates instead of stainless steel plates into the columns. So we discovered after a number of years, I think maybe it was you, Noel, that did discover that, lo and behold, our grain whisky had a flavour. Now, the second thing that Cooley did, and indeed I suspect most Irish distillers are doing now, the grain whisky was matured in first use American oak barrels, which was anathema to the Scots and to Irish distillers, because they simply wanted a base. So they wanted the cheapest possible Irish whisky, so they used third and fourth use whisky cask. We didn't. We used first use for Irish whisky. So we had the flavour of the cask, and we had a slight flavour coming out of the columns. And it's just a superb product. Now, as happened is as you always need luck, tastes turned our way. And the taste for the last 20 years is young people with a sweeter tooth have turned to sweeter drinks like bourbon. And Irish grain whiskey is, particularly that's used in good casks, is a fabulous product. And I'm a missionary here. I really believe very strongly in grain whiskey. I think there's a massive future in the developing world, in the Far East, in South America, and in the US. And I think it'll get better and significantly bigger percentage of whiskey. Now, belatedly, Irish Distillers is in it. They have a single grain whiskey, and the Scots are looking at it. And it's only very recently, but it was kind of in Cooley. It wasn't so much an accident, but it was a plan that we would make a light, Swedish whiskey that would appeal to young people. Sorry about that, Noel. I took your powder.
No, not at all. I mean, I think at the time as well, John, I mean, one of the reasons we ended up using bourbon barrels as well was because we just couldn't get anything else. And we didn't have a stock of casks that we were emptying, because we filled a lot of whiskey in 1990, 91 and 92. And we just didn't have any barrels that we were emptying because we hadn't any whiskey to make. And it wasn't till after that we started to put to fill whiskey into second or third fill barrels. So we had a good stock of new bourbon casks, and that is really the quintessential part of the spirit for the likes of Greenore and for Cullen 10-year-old and our single grains. But also the fact that as things developed, and we did discover that the whiskey tasted exceptionally well, and we did have a lot of it. It was always intended, as John said, to make a lighter whiskey, and the grain was the biggest component of that for some of the blends that we produced. And a lot of Scotch blends use an awful lot of different malt flavors and different malt distilleries to make a blend, and they put something like 20, 30, 40 malts into a blend. We didn't have that luxury in Cooley. So we were using a small pinch of peated malt maybe to make a difference in a blend, but the blend was mostly grain and not that much malt. And of course, as time went on, we started off, I think Kilbeggan had about 30% malt, and some of the supermarket blends that we actually made for that became quite popular as well had as little as 5% malt in them. Because the grain was that good. So, I mean, having a single grain also was something unusual. And as John pointed out as well, there weren't even many Scotch ones, and there's still not. And there's still even some of the ones that are there aren't that great. But, and again, their whole perspective on making whiskey was use the grain as a thinner to thin out the flavor of the malt, and they carried the whiskey with the malt flavors. And that was their strategy, whereas we chopped that around. And again, you know, I mean, the blends like Jameson and Bushmills and Blackbush. Blackbush was made with a grain that was made in Middleton from bourbon casks particularly, and while Paddy and Jameson had different styles of grain. They make two types of grain down there, and we made a couple of different styles in Cooley as well. But generally speaking, the whole concept was to have a grain that could stand on its own at the end of it all, and that was what Greenore was. And I've actually got a very, very rare bottling of it here, which is a 10-year-old grain, and this was only released in Canada. The other ones that we went up to, we had a 19-year-old and 21, I think, at the end of it all. So yeah, it's been very, very popular, and it is really, really lovely whiskey. But when people hear the word grain, they think, oh, you know, you've tried these things.
One of your former colleagues at Cooley, John Cashman, has just come in on the chat there to concur that the Greenore 8-year-old was one of the all-time great Irish whiskies, and certainly the amount of awards that it won, the International Wine and Spirits competition, a gold medal and best in class in 2010, World Whiskies Award best in class in 2011 and 2012. It goes to show that innovation and risk-taking can really pay off when you have the mindset for it. I suppose, just in the context of current environment and so on, I think even though Cooley was founded and opened during one of the decades of worst recessions in Ireland, it went from strength to strength and won over 300 medals since opening. Other awards that were received was European Distiller of the Year 2008 and 2009, Distillery of the Year in 2009 in the International Wine and Spirits Competition, and Distillery of the Year in 2010 in the Malt Advocate. John, as many of us will have heard you say in some of your presentations over the years, dealing with uncertainty is definitely one of the key attributes needed for success in business. Here at the home of Powerscourt Distillery, the estate has seen many challenges and adversity over the decades, from the burning down of the magnificent estate house to the difficult times, trading times in the 80s and after the 2008 crash. Our own brand has been very much grounded in perseverance, determined optimism, and a belief in the quality of our product. And I suppose just in the aftermath of this unprecedented world pandemic and the possibility of facing into another recession, this is true more than ever. And coming back to our title this evening, The Independent Mindset, I wanted to ask you all, the three of you individually, what would your advice be to distilleries and distillery owners and brand owners today, not only to survive difficult times, but thrive and keep this golden age of Irish whiskey going? Perhaps we can start with you, Willie.
Well,
just throw out the gauntlet.
Yeah, they used to teach courses in this in MIT.
Are the ones you miss?
I've no doubt.
I think there's a very good article in the Irish Times today about Ernest Shackleton's menu for what one should do, and the first thing he had was optimism. And I think, you know, we've all got to look beyond this. I also said you've got to have patience. And I think, you know, got to have patience before we can get out of this, and just, you know, do everything we can to stick with it. Don't believe doomsayers that are telling you this is the end of the world. It's not the end of the world. People survived the Spanish flu, as it was called, and 2 world wars. We'll survive this. The Irish whiskey industry is, you know, when John and I were in the plough, it was 100,000 cases into the US. Today, it's coming up on 12 million cases sales. Scotch has 90 million. Bourbon, I think, in the 30s. So there's a long way to go for the Irish whiskey industry. And if we just keep our nerve, keep going, keep innovating, because innovation, as has been demonstrated with the grain and the peated and other things that Cooley did, you know, if we continue to innovate, get our niches correctly, and keep going, and don't be put off by rather temporary, we hope, events, we'll get there. And we knew all this in the plough, John, didn't we?
Of course.
I think, thank you very much, Willie. Very inspiring words there. And John, do you have?
Yeah, we're older. Willie and I are older. Are we wiser? Yeah. Do we make a lot of mistakes? No, but we made new mistakes all the time. I believe, as to a greater extent now than I did 40 years ago, or 50 years ago when we looked at this, that the opportunity in Irish whiskey is huge. It just is huge. It's a difficult industry because it's controlled essentially by a monopoly or an oligopoly. And it's very hard to compete with the multinationals who have 60, 70, 80% of the business. They have the shelf space and they have the distribution. It just is. We struggled long and hard in Cooley to try and get, and I know some of the guys who are listening to this are going to say, yeah, I understand it, to get on the shelf. And even if we got on the shelf, then we had to get off the shelf, which was, you know, you needed big marketing money. And I know my 2 sons are struggling with that at the moment and doing a very good job. And it's just difficult, but the opportunity is there. How do you compete with these large dominant multinationals whose job it is to stop you? I mean, that's their nature. It's not bad. That's what they're supposed to do. And Willie mentioned it, it's innovation. You can't attack them head on because there'll only be one winner. You've got to go around them, over them, or under them. You're not going to go through them. And that requires innovation. And that is very difficult in the industry because the dominant players don't want innovation because they see it as a threat. Correctly, it is a threat. So you have to innovate, and which I think a lot of young companies do and will. That's why they establish these companies. They see something they can do that they think they can do better than anybody else. I think there are wonderful opportunities out there, as we talked about a couple of them tonight. I think the peat is one. I think pot still, which I didn't see. I think that's worked out very well. And I think the grain is going to be a big seller. And there'll be other types of products, different casks, different ages, different blends. And that's what you're going to have to do. Willie is right. It takes perseverance, but the nature of starting up your own business is perseverance. I mean, you're not going to do it unless you know you can do it. And time. Now, some will struggle with money because David Hines has a wonderful thing when people ask him, you know, how much do I need to set up a distillery? He says 10 million minimum. I think that is a real minimum that you have to do that, and that frightens people. But I'm waffling again, but the opportunities are very big. You're going to have to be open-minded. I'm not so sure it's going to be in the traditional markets, even though they're growing fabulously. Who would have seen a 2 million case market in Eastern Europe and Russia 5 years ago even? Who would have seen South Africa, which was nothing in 1996, now be, I think, is it the third or fourth biggest Irish whiskey market? 500,000 cases from 5,000. So these are there, all of South America, Nigeria, places like that. So you're going to spend a lot of time in an airplane, as indeed John Cashman did. If he was here, I used to spend a bit. We all do. So, but the opportunities are huge, but it's innovation.
Thank you very much for that, John. And Noel, what would you say?
Well, I think that the two previous speakers, who I admire significantly a lot, and have given us a very good insight into where they're coming from. I agree with John that innovation is key. I do think that smaller, we have a lot of small companies now, and the big advantage that a small company has is they're very nimble and they can change direction very quickly, and they need to be able to see opportunities in the marketplace and jump in, because again, there is a huge market out there, and you know, it is a very, very competitive market, the drinks industry. And I'm not just talking about whiskey, we're talking about the whole range from vodka and tequila and all of those kind of products and drinks. Innovation in the marketplace is hugely important as well. Packaging and all of that kind of thing. You find social media at the moment is massive in marketing products and stuff like that. So the people that can use those tools successfully are the people that will get their product to their audience and the customers. And building a loyal customer base is essentially a really smart thing in this industry, because we've seen this in Cooley, we've seen it in Iron, we've seen it in Teelings now. We're doing very successful relaunches of a lot of different styles of whiskies and having a different take on things, you know, and there's a lot of that needs to be done to develop the market further. And I think that this current crisis has left us all thinking a little bit, scratching our heads and saying, well, what happens next? And I mean, the bar industry, we all see how that's suffering at the moment. But very shortly, I think we have to have confidence that, you know, as William said about the pandemic in 1918, this thing will get dealt with and will be finished, and we will all be back in the bars toasting whatever might be the occasion of the day. And I think getting the customers to appreciate what they're actually doing with our products is key to success. And I think we've got a great future for Irish whiskey, because we have a great reputation worldwide as a people. So I think that that can only help. So I look forward to it. It's a challenge every day is a challenge. Everything pops up something different, but it depends on how you cope with those things that builds the character in us and in what we do as Irish people.
Well, I think, Noel, that sums it up very well, and it's been a pleasure chatting with you this evening, you all, and getting your very significant grains of wisdom on what was a very unique time for the industry. And we have one or two questions that have just come in, and I'll put those to you now. One, I think, was for Willie on the, let me see, the historical Watts advertised their whiskey from the Waterside Distillery as pot still. Was that always the case? Was it part of Cooley's strategy to reposition it as a malt instead? Does that sound familiar, Willie?
Well,
From Niall Tuberty.
Watts had two distilleries in Derry, Abbey Street and the Waterside Distillery. Abbey Street was really a grain distillery with its two enormous coffee stills. The Waterside was a malt or pot still distillery, and Tyrconnell was their brand. From the Watts believed that Tyrconnell, which was a pot still or single malt, went back, or single malt wasn't really known in those days, went back to, they said, to 1762, when Mr. Watt came from Ramelton to Derry.
Okay. Well, I hope that answers that question for you, Niall. And we're getting in some really lovely comments for you both, John and Willie. They've been, our audience has been enjoying listening to two legends of Irish whiskey industry. So we are absolutely delighted we could have you with us this evening.
Caroline, I hope you're not saying this is the Statler and Waldorf of Irish whiskey.
No, I'm trying to segue onto the point, Willie, that we will absolutely have to have you both back again, because this is just a mere tip of the iceberg. There's lots of other interesting topics to discuss, and I know there's quite a few topical ones at the moment, but we just want to extend our thanks to you both, and indeed Noel, for the chat this evening. And I just want to let all our audience know that we will be discussing our own pot still next week with Fionn O'Connor, so please do join us for that webinar. And I think this is of interest to everybody listening. We have Father's Day coming up on the 21st of June, and what better present than a lovely bottle of Irish whiskey. So we certainly have lots to choose from on our website from Fercullen, and we're doing a special offer with our trilogy pack and some of our new fill malt, actually, which will be a lovely addition to a gift for Dad. So thank you so much, everybody, for your interaction and the questions and commentary every week. Just everyone is just very thankful for your open, honest chat this evening, gentlemen. From Charles Roach to Noel Martin, he said to say hello to one of his closest friends, a class friend, Mr. Horgan. So I don't know if that rings a bell, John, or not.
Does indeed, yes.
Yes, great. So I'll wrap it up there. And again, thank you so much for joining us. And we will hopefully be back together again at some point to discuss again the wonderful opportunities that lie in front of us in the Irish whiskey industry.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. Good evening, all.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, folks.
Thanks, guys.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.